When you hear the word Viking, what pops into your head? Probably something like this. A massive, bearded warrior wearing a horned helmet, standing on the deck of a dragon-headed longship, screaming at the wind, ready to burn down a monastery or two before breakfast. And yes, raiding did happen. But what if I told you the daily life of most Vikings was, honestly, a bit more boring, and also much more fascinating? You see, Vikings weren't just pirates of the medieval seas. They were farmers, traders, blacksmiths, poets, explorers, shipbuilders, and yes, occasionally part-time raiders when the opportunity knocked. Imagine living in a wooden longhouse on a chilly fjord, waking up before dawn not to sharpen your axe for pillaging, but to milk the cows, mend fishing nets, and argue with your neighbors about goats trespassing into your pasture. It's not quite as cinematic, but it's how most of them actually lived. And the funniest part? Most of the fearsome Vikings you read about were technically only Vikings when they went on a Viking, which literally just meant an overseas expedition, often for trade. Back home, they were just regular folks. Fathers, mothers, kids, farmers, artisans with worries like taxes, crop failures, and whether the gods were in a good mood this season. Over the next few minutes, let's set aside the pop culture helmets and flaming villages. Instead, we'll step into the smoky warmth of a real Viking longhouse, meet the people who lived there, and see what their world looked like, from what they wore to what they ate, how they traded silk from the east, how their laws worked, and yes, what they really thought about raiding. Let's leave behind the roaring seas and step onto solid ground. A coastal village somewhere in what's now Norway. It's dawn. The air is sharp and cold. And before anyone thinks about raiding, there's work to be done. A lot of it. Most Viking families lived in longhouses. Big, narrow buildings built from timber and topped with a thick turf or thatch roof. They were called longhouses for a reason. Imagine a rectangle up to 70 feet long, dark inside except for the central hearth. Windows? Forget it. Viking windows were either tiny slits or non-existent, good for keeping heat in and raiders out. The hearth in the center burned all day, filling the air with smoke that slowly drifted out through a hole in the roof. So yes, living inside often meant smelling like last night's fire, and probably a bit like the goats that sometimes shared your living space. A typical household wasn't just mom, dad, and the kids' dot. It could include grandparents, farmhands, freed slaves, distant cousins, and sometimes even livestock in winter. Sleeping arrangements? No private bedrooms. People slept on benches or raised wooden platforms along the walls, covered in furs and woolen blankets. Privacy was about as real as those horned helmets. Despite their tough reputation, Vikings mostly ate what they farmed: barley, rye bread, dairy, fish, and the occasional meat from sheep, goats, or cattle. They loved stews cooked over the hearth, flavored with wild herbs. Fish, salted or dried, was a daily staple. And for dessert, honey was the main sweetener, which also became the key ingredient in mead, the famous Viking honey wine. Was it glamorous? Not really. But it kept them alive through long winters when the fjords froze over. Forget endless furs and iron armor. Most Viking men wore woolen tunics over linen shirts, with trousers and leather shoes. Women wore long linen dresses under heavier woolen overdresses, fastened with brooches that often doubled as jewelry. Clothes had to be practical. It was cold, wet, and windy. Bright colors were surprisingly common. Red, blue, and green dyes were popular if you could afford them. And yes, they loved jewelry. Silver armbands, brooches, beads, even for everyday wear. Viking fashion was about showing off status as much as keeping warm. Daily life meant endless chores. Men farmed, hunted, fished, built boats, and repaired tools. Women spun wool, wove cloth, cooked, kept the household, and made cheese and butter. Children helped from an early age, herding animals or gathering firewood. And while raids did happen, they were seasonal, spring and summer, when seas were calmer and fields didn't need as much attention. For most Vikings, the year revolved around planting, harvesting, repairing, and surviving the winter. And despite the image of wild, chaotic warriors, Viking society was surprisingly organized. They had local assemblies called things where disputes were settled, laws were debated, and people could even sue each other over property lines or insults. Imagine a village gathering where someone says, "He stole my goat," and the local assembly spends hours arguing the fine points of goat law. So yes, Vikings could be fierce raiders, but back home, they were also farmers, craftsmen, parents, and deeply tied to the land and their small communities. We love to picture Vikings sailing off with swords and shields, raiding monasteries and shouting Valhalla at the top of their lungs. But here's the plot twist history textbooks often skip. For every Viking who crossed the sea to raid, there were many more who crossed it to trade. Yes, the iconic Viking longship was fast and terrifying, but it was also incredibly practical, able to sail in deep water or slide right up onto a beach. And Vikings built more than just warships. Nars, broad, sturdy cargo ships, could carry tons of goods across the North Sea and even to the Mediterranean. Coastal boats moved furs, timber, and grain from village to village. Viking sailors were basically the logistics experts of their day. If it could be traded, they'd figure out how to move it. A lot more than stolen chalices, furs and hides from the north, walrus ivory, amber, beeswax, iron tools, soapstone, and even slaves. And in return, they brought home silver coins, silk from the east, spices, wine, glass beads, and luxury goods that impressed everyone back in the fjords. The real mind-blower? Just how far Vikings traveled peacefully. In the west, they founded trading towns like Dublin and York. In the east, Swedish Vikings, known as the Varangians, sailed down rivers like the Dnieper and Volga, all the way to the Black and Caspian Seas. They traded in Kiev, Novgorod, and even reached the great markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. Some Vikings didn't just trade with Byzantium. They signed up as elite bodyguards for the Byzantine emperor. Imagine bearded giants from Norway and Sweden standing in marble palaces, dressed in silk tunics, guarding an emperor who spoke Greek. They were famous for their loyalty, strength, and, reportedly, their habit of partying a bit too hard when off duty. Raiding and trading weren't two separate careers. Often, the same people did both. In summer, raid or explore. In winter, farm, craft, trade. And sometimes they stopped moving altogether, founding towns like Dublin, Kiev, and York, which became major medieval trade hubs. By the 10th century, some Vikings who'd left home as raiders were living as settled merchants. Local lords and craftsmen married to local women, raising kids who barely spoke Old Norse. It's easy to forget, but Viking traders helped connect the Islamic world and Europe through silver and silk, the Baltic and the Mediterranean, and even briefly Europe and North America. They were as much a part of medieval globalization as caravans on the Silk Road. So next time you picture a Viking, don't just see the axe and shield. Imagine someone haggling over amber prices in a smoky market, or sailing thousands of kilometers just to bring home a single bolt of silk. When people think about Viking religion, it usually boils down to big angry guys shouting Odin before battle and hoping to get into Valhalla. And yes, dying bravely in battle was considered a ticket to Valhalla. But the Viking worldview was much richer, stranger, and more poetic than the stereotypes suggest. Vikings imagined the universe as a huge ash tree called Yggdrasil. Its branches and roots connected different worlds. Asgard, the realm of the gods like Odin and Thor. Midgard, the world of humans. Jotunheim, home of the giants. And other realms like Hel, Alfheim, and Muspelheim, The gods themselves weren't perfect. They lied, fought, cheated, and got tricked by giants. In Viking eyes, that didn't make them weaker. It made them more relatable. Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, god of wisdom, war, and poetry, always seeking knowledge, even if it cost him dearly. Thor, the thunder god, loved by ordinary people for his straightforward strength and loyalty. Not the Hollywood version, but still wielding the hammer Mjolnir. Freya, goddess of love, fertility, and war, who received half of those who died in battle. Loki, the trickster, brilliant, charming, and dangerously unpredictable. Not quite evil, but definitely a cosmic agent of chaos. Vikings carved runes into stones, wood, and weapons, not just as an alphabet, but as magical symbols. Runes were believed to carry power, for luck, protection, or cursing enemies. Rituals weren't daily prayers in churches. Instead, they happened outdoors, at sacred groves, by stones, or near springs. And sacrifices could be anything from food and drink to animals, and in rare cases, people, especially when times were desperate. If you were important, your funeral could be epic, laid in a ship or buried with one, surrounded by weapons, jewelry, tools, everything you might need in the next life. Covered by stones arranged in the shape of a ship, or buried under an earth mound. The famous burning ship funeral? It did happen sometimes, but was rarer than Hollywood suggests. And whether you ended up in Valhalla or in Freya's Hall, the real goal was to be remembered. Because in Viking culture, to live on in story and song was a kind of immortality. Vikings had no single holy book. Instead, they told and retold sagas, stories of gods, heroes, and ancestors. These sagas weren't frozen texts. They changed as people told them around the fire. And yes, they included plenty of heroic duels, family feuds that lasted generations, and enough witty insults to fill a medieval stand-up routine. In the end, what Vikings valued wasn't just gold or conquest. Honor and reputation, loyalty to family and friends, courage, and the idea that life was short. Fate was often cruel, but it was worth living bravely and memorably. So yes, they could be fierce and violent, but they also built poems, laws, and legends that still fascinate us over 1,000 years later. All stories must end, even those told in smoky longhouses on winter nights. So, what finally closed the curtain on the Viking Age? By the late 10th and 11th centuries, Viking raiders faced something new, stronger, better organized kingdoms in England and France. Stone castles that didn't burn as easily as wooden monasteries. And maybe most importantly, the spread of Christianity. When Scandinavia converted, it wasn't just about new gods. It meant new alliances, new laws, and an end to the old tribal way of life where raiding your neighbor was a perfectly acceptable business plan. Kings wanted to rule entire kingdoms, not war-bands. So they banned private raiding and built navies to defend, rather than plunder. By the 11th century, trading towns like Bergen, Dublin, and Novgorod mattered more than stolen treasure. And Viking traders discovered something awkward but powerful. It was easier to get rich by selling fish, furs, and iron than by stealing gold chalices from monks. The age of sudden raids gave way to the age of steady profit. The Longships disappeared from the rivers of Europe. But Viking words stayed in our languages. Window from Old Norse vindauga, wind-eye. Sky from Old Norse ske, cloud. Knife, egg, law, husband. The list goes on. And Viking descendants helped shape England, Ireland, France, and even Russia. Even today, cities like York, Dublin, and Kiev still carry traces of Viking streets beneath modern asphalt. The age of the Vikings ended, but the story didn't. So next time you see a TV Viking screaming in slow motion with a horned helmet, remember, real Vikings were far too busy farming, trading, suing each other at the local assembly, and occasionally writing beautifully rude poetry. If you enjoyed sailing through history with us, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. Because unlike a Viking raid, it costs nothing and leaves everyone happier.